unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're recording this episode on May 13th, just one day after the close of the sixth phase of the general election. Believe it or not, we have just one more phase to go. Joining me to discuss the latest developments from the campaign trail today is the author James Crabtree. James was the Mumbai bureau chief of the Financial Times from 2011 to 2016 and is currently a professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore. You also know James as the author of the best-selling book, The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age. He has just wrapped up an election trip to India where he spent some of the time on the campaign trail, and I'm very pleased to have him on the show today. James, welcome to Grand Tamasha.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm a practiced listener to this podcast, so delightful to be on.
Excellent to hear. Let me just start with the kind of big picture. You returned from a trip to India just a week or so ago to do some election reporting. Tell us where you were and what you did while you were there.
Yeah, so earlier in this podcast, you interviewed Ruchir Sharma, the author and investor, about his book on India, which was a travelogue of his repeated journeys around Indian elections with a group of reporters and analysts. And a couple of years ago, I managed to talk my way into becoming a member of that group. And so I accompanied them on one of their trips in Uttar Pradesh in 2017. And I joined them again this year. It's a group of about 20 people. And so we went to West Bengal for a couple of days, escaping just in time to avoid the hurricane last week, and then spent the best part of a week journeying through Uttar Pradesh, starting in Lucknow and getting to Varanasi by way of Allahabad and various villages along the way, trying to get a sense of the state of play in India's most important electoral state.
So let's start exactly right there with Uttar Pradesh, which is hands down the most pivotal fight this election season, as it is in many election seasons. There we have a showdown between the Grand Alliance of the BSP and the SP against the ruling BJP, with the Congress as a sort of minor, third front player. Tell me about the state of the race there. I think the popular narrative is that the alliance has performed well in the first few phases and the BJP is playing catch up. Does that conventional narrative fit with your observations, from the ground?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I suppose the first thing that I would say, and I think many of your guests have said, is that nobody really knows anything about what's actually happening at the moment. I mean, the polling evidence is reasonably unreliable, insofar as you can glean anything from turnout. It's hard to draw any definitive conclusions. But I suppose what I was looking for, given that Modi and the BJP won so comprehensively in 2014, was to find people on the ground who were Modi voters who are now changing back to Gathbandhan, which is the name of the alliance of the BSP and the SP. And certainly in the rural areas, in villages, we found plenty of evidence of that. Again, it's anecdotal, so it's hard to say exactly what it amounts to. But in village after village, we would find people who said that they voted for Modi in 2014 and they were now going to switch back to voting for either the BSP or the SP, depending on which candidate or which party happened to be running in that particular seat.
And what would you say is the source of this, buyer's remorse, if we could call it that? I mean, these are voters who backed Modi, led to an unprecedented victory in 2014. Why are they switching their votes, or potentially switching their votes in 2019?
Well, I think the primary issue, and I say this somewhat gingerly, comes down to caste. That was the message that we heard over and over again, was that in a sense, what happened in 2014 was Modi managed to reach unusually deeply into the lower castes of UP for a party that traditionally has drawn much of its strength from the upper caste. And there seems to be a process of mean reversion as many of those voters return either if they're Dalits or from the lower class to Mayawati and the BSP, or if they're Yadavs or others to the SP. But we also found that there were particular local issues, and one of the things that was interesting was you on this podcast and a lot of other analysts have talked a lot about rural distress as an issue that's very important in this election. And actually, we found surprisingly little evidence of that as a kind of broad theme. We didn't find too many people in villages complaining that the harvests had been poor. Many of them had got payments from Modi's government, and there was signs of other welcome forms of infrastructure, particularly the provision of toilets was very striking. Every village had at least one and often many freshly built toilets. But there were particular issues that came up again and again. The one that was most prominent was the issue of free roaming cows, which I guess we can explain in a little bit more detail. But there has been a phenomenon in which rural areas in UP have been beset by roaming cattle, and that as a source of anger against the government, partly of Modi, but also partly against UP Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath. That was very palpable in the number of the places that we visited.
And in addition to the question of stray cattle, which people sort of draw a line from the cow protection movements, the bans or curbs on slaughterhouses and so forth, to kind of this proliferation of cattle which are eating farmers' crops. You know, one emerging trend we're seeing in the news reporting, sort of stories about the Congress party and what effect the Congress is having. You know, is it in fact splitting the opposition vote, or is it tactically taking votes away from the BJP, particularly from their upper caste support base? You had the chance to see Priyanka Gandhi up close and personal during your trip. Needless to say, there was a lot of anticipation about her kind of prime time electoral debut. What do you think about how she's performing, and, you know, will she have much of an impact on the Congress Party's fortunes in the state?
Yes, I'd never seen Priyanka Gandhi in action before, and so we saw her speak at a rally and then got to speak to her off the record at a kind of private meeting. And she was impressive, forceful, articulate, clearly, in a sense, worried about the direction that the country was going in, although her performance on the stump was rather less impressive. And she wasn't drawing particularly large crowds who went to see her speak in her mother's constituency in Raebareli, just outside of Lucknow. So, I think undeniably in UP, she has attracted more attention, and that probably can't hurt the Congress Party. But I think she and those around the Congress Party are really seeing this election as part of a gradual rebuilding effort, in which the real aim is the state elections in 2021. And I think you can see that in the reason why, in the end, the Congress, despite the fact that it wanted to be part of this wider alliance, was rejected by Mayawati, the leader of the BSP, for reasons which I think are fairly transparently to do with the fact those two parties are likely to compete with one another in the state elections in a few years' time.
I want to shift to talking about West Bengal, because this is a state that the BJP is, believes that it could make serious inroads into, which would potentially offset losses it would incur in the Hindi belt. In 2014, just to remind our listeners, the BJP won 2 seats in West Bengal, which, doesn't sound like a lot, but it's the same number of seats, that the left won, and the left was in power for 3 decades in Bengal. Give us a sense of the battle that's emerging there and whether the ground seems ripe, in your view, for the BJP to expand its position.
So we went to see Mamata Banerjee, the chief minister of West Bengal, in a suburb north of Calcutta a couple of days before the cyclone blew in, and it was a little bit like watching a mini cyclone in progress. Mamata Banerjee is a diminutive in stature, but fiery in nature. And although she didn't used to have a reputation as a particularly eloquent political speaker, we watched her give a real bravura performance. bashing Modi and enticing the crowd with call and response chants of the watchman is a thief, Chaudhka Chor Hai. I suppose whether you think the BJP has a chance of making inroads, you have to take a call on the nature of her government, and that is sort of offered some contradictory pictures. Liberal commentators tend to worry that under her rule, the Trinamool Congress has taken on some characteristics of the old communist government, which was in which political cadres infiltrated all areas of the state and in which there was a well-deserved reputation for thuggery. And so, in a sense, the problems associated with her government have been part of why people thought the government might make inroads. But actually, on the stump, Mamata Banerjee gave a almost sort of pleasingly liberal image of West Bengal as a model of social harmony and assailed the BJP for its communal politics. Her base is at least partially made up of Muslim voters who make up about a third of West Bengal. And so she, talked at length about how she and her government and people in West Bengal in general try and eschew any forms of communal and partisan division. And so that was all very touching, but didn't sort of stack up very neatly with the way that she's meant to have governed. We asked a lot of people in the state whether they thought the BJP was going to make these much vaunted inroads. I mean, if the BJP is going to, as you've talked about many times on the podcast, it's going to make up what it's likely to lose in the Hindi heartland. It needs to make inroads in West Bengal, Orissa, and a smattering around other parts of eastern India. We didn't find very many people who really thought that there was going to be that kind, the thought that the BJP might win 20 seats. I don't think anybody felt that was terribly likely. Most people were predicting basically a repeat of what happened last time, in which the Trinamool Congress won, high 20s, low 30s of seats. And so if the BJP does very well in West Bengal, then it will be a surprise to political analysts in West Bengal.
So as I understand it, the group sort of ends its trips by making individual predictions about the election outcome. And I'm not going to ask you, James, necessarily to tell us yours, but tell us what the consensus forecast of the group is.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, we're allowed to do that. So drum roll, the consensus forecast or the conventional wisdom was BJP 215 seats, Congress 95, and then we were also asked what we thought was going to happen in West Bengal and how many seats we thought the Gathbandhan in particular would get in UP. And so the consensus was that Trinamool Congress would get 31 seats and Gathbandhan would get 40. And I suppose, most of your listeners can probably in their head work out what that means. That means Modi is likely to become Prime Minister again, but in order to do so, he's going to have to rustle up 2 or maybe 3 political parties, probably from the southern and eastern states, the likes of Jagan Reddy in Andhra Pradesh or Naveen Patnaik in Orissa. And once he's got a couple or more of these parties that have, 10, 15, 20 votes, then he'll probably have enough for an electoral majority in the Lok Sabha. There were, however, obviously that's the average. So there were plenty of people who were predicting a worse performance from the BJP than that. And I suppose, since I think the conventional wisdom, however people define this, has been trending against Modi for the last week or maybe 2. And so I think people have been revising down their forecast based on a range of different feelings about the way that the campaign is going in its latter stages. And so there were a number of members of our groups who thought that the BJP was going to get nearer 200 or potentially below 200, and then that gets you into the intriguing parlor game of what would happen to Modi's position if the BJP fell below that number, and would it be able to find a kind of find allies, especially if Modi himself remained as prime minister. So that was what a lot of the kind of gossiping on the trip was about.
So I want to end this session like we do every week by asking you to share with our listeners one story coming out of India that you think hasn't been adequately reported, but that they need to be paying attention to. What would be on your list?
Well, I think I'll go back to what we mentioned earlier, which was the cow menace in UP, because if it does indeed turn out that the BJP do worse than expected, I was really surprised by this story. I'd read about it, and as you say, it goes back to the decision by Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath to close or limit slaughterhouses, which has increased the number of cattle that would have found a happy home in the sky, who are now free to roam. And the anger that we consistently heard about this issue as we traveled across UP, I found very striking. And so I think if you have one particular issue which is driving voters away from Modi in the most important state of the country, then although there have been articles written about this, then I think perhaps it hasn't been covered as comprehensively, particularly in the international press, as it might have been.
So my nominee for the week actually is the poll-related violence in West Bengal. The Panchayat elections, which happened a few years ago, the local elections in West Bengal saw quite a bit of violence, very credible allegations of booth capturing, voter intimidation, outright fraud. I should just point out that local elections are conducted by the State Election Commission, which has no relation to the Central Election Commission, which handles all state and national elections. But I think the view is that whatever thuggery took place under the 3 decades of the communist rule in Bengal, that thuggery has consisted. It's just merely the kind of partisan stripes of the people doing the thuggery or the coercion have changed. The special observer for the Election Commission called West Bengal a quote-unquote problematic state. And it's interesting to see, in contrast to, say, 15 or 20 years ago, when a lot of the focus was on Bihar and UP and the kind of quote-unquote badlands of the Hindi belt, a lot of the attention this time around has been focused on West Bengal when it comes to this kind of muscle power that we talk about during election campaigns. Who had the best week in India this week, in your view?
Right, so I'm going to go for the phrase of the day, this being recorded on Monday. So this has been a good week for, quote, the Khan market crowd. Many of your listeners will have read the rather peculiar interview which Narendra Modi gave to the Indian Express, which has been a subject of much discussion over the last 24 hours. Modi often complains about his treatment from the Lutyens group, or Lutyens Delhi, meaning the old English-speaking establishment. But at least, to my knowledge, I've never heard him or the BJP complaining about what he in this interview called the Khan market crowd, which I take to mean a younger group of left-leaning journalists who hang out at the various cafes in Khan Market in central Delhi. And so on social media today, there's been great sport in trying to work out which of the particular cafes is actually the sort of ground zero of the Khan market crowd by self-described members of that group. So I think as a kind of instant Indian nationalist right-wing villain, the Khan market crowd emerging from nowhere to become the figure of hate du jour is certainly a good week for India's liberal scribblers.
And I mean, the nexus clearly has to be Perch, so I don't even understand how this dispute about this.
Yeah, no, I think that was the consensus view, that the very heart of the Khan Market Easters was to be found in the Perch Cafe in Khan Market.
So my vote for the best week is KCR, K. Chandrasekhar Rao, the Chief Minister of the state of Telangana, who won an overwhelming re-election in the December state assembly elections. He has already been sort of positioning himself as a potential kingmaker in 2019. He first bandied about this idea of a federal front, so a government that would be cobbled together of regional parties unaffiliated with either the BJP or the Congress. He has engaged in a kind of shuttle diplomacy with both the Congress and the BJP I think, trying to angle himself and his party to strike a deal in the event that neither side is able to win an outright majority. And so because he's expected to do quite well in Telangana, I think he's certainly a political player to watch in the days and weeks ahead. So, James, who, in your opinion, had the worst week in India this week?
I'm not sure if it's absolutely the worst week, but I thought a fun bad week would be Gautam Gambhir, the former cricket star of India, now turned pugilistic BJP candidate in the seat of East Delhi, one of the 7 Lok Sabha seats in the capital. And so Gambhir morphed from cricketer to online sort of Twitter personality who dabbled in politics and then gradually became more and more political and ended up becoming the BJP's candidate in East Delhi. And both because it's Delhi and also because he's a famous cricketer, that contest has attracted particular attention. Now, why did he have a bad week? For 2 reasons. Firstly, there was some discussion about the fact that during the campaign he may or may not have used what was called a body double, in which a friend of his appeared to stand in for him in a car that was being driven around Delhi. So instead of him standing out of the sunroof or at the top of this vehicle, he sat inside and rested while his friend allegedly took his place. But more particularly, there was a day or two of high drama as he or his campaign were accused by Atishi Marlena, who's the Aam Aadmi Party candidate and who has been a high-profile and very articulate advocate for that party and potentially could win what is a very tightly watched seat. And she accused the party, the BJP, of circulating a particularly nasty election leaflet, and in a tearful press conference gave details of this, which then prompted Gambhir to file a litigation suit against her and her party claiming defamation. But in the end, Gambhir didn't come out of any of this, I think, looking particularly good, although it's hard to say how much damage it will have done to his election chances overall.
So my nominee for the worst week is Sam Pitroda, who is the gaffe-prone advisor to Rahul Gandhi in the Congress Party. He's a famous NRI entrepreneur who has been seen with Rahul Gandhi on the campaign and kind of accompanied him to his various U.S. visits when he was here a couple of years ago. Sam Pitroda was asked a question about the 1984 Sikh riots, in which many Congress politicians have been implicated of fomenting the horrific violence against the Sikh community in Delhi. And his response was essentially, well, if it happened, it happened, which he immediately walked back, saying that his response came across the wrong way because of his poor command of Hindi, which didn't win him any supporters online. So I would say Sam Pitroda earned my nominee for the worst week in India. And I believe it's the second time since we've launched the podcast that the Congress spokespersons have found their way into the worst week category. So not a great campaign for Congress spokespeople. James, thanks so much for coming. Congratulations on the success of The Billionaire Raj, which I should mention to our readers is now out in paperback. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, just came out. So available in an airport bookshop near you.
Thanks for joining us and look forward to your post-election commentary.
Thanks so much, Milan. It's been a great podcast, a great pleasure to be on. Keep it up. We want this to continue after the election's finished.
So after a quick break, I'll be back to talk with the journalist Rukmini on the state of political journalism in India, the BJP's electoral math, and the status of caste politics. My guest on the show today is Rukmini. Rukmini is one of India's finest data journalists. Her work focuses on gender, caste, inequality, and politics. She's worked at the Times of India, The Hindu, and the Huffington Post. She's currently a freelance journalist based in Chennai and the author of the terrific How India Votes series for the online news site Scroll. I'm pleased to welcome her to the show. Rukmini, nice to have you on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me, Milan.
So as we approach the end of this seemingly interminable election season, I want to begin by asking you about the state of political journalism in India. You recently tweeted something that caught my eye. You said, quote, you felt deep disappointment with the lack of new directions that most election reporting has gone in, end quote. Tell us why you feel this way about the state of political journalism.
So I remember at the end of 2014, looking back at the election and feeling a number of things, but about journalism, definitely feeling that it can't be this way in 2019. It's not going to be this way, is it? And I remember that feeling so tangibly, partly because it's exactly how I feel now again. Some of it is just the usual stuff, bias and sort of fawning political interviews, that sort of stuff that, most people will agree is outright wrong, right? But beyond the stuff that's clearly wrong, there's just the lack of imagination that's bothered me. And I think one of the things that's happened since 2014 for me personally is that one, I moved away from Delhi, and two, I had kids. So I think I now consume my news much more like the average news consumer than I did when I lived in Delhi. So first of all, my bandwidth for, what do Americans call it, inside baseball, inside basketball, really sort of involved intra-party stuff, my bandwidth for that has really reduced. But from political reporting spread out across the country, I'd say there was and still are sort of two ways that people seem to do it, and I wish the two would intersect more. One is very sort of hardcore politics, party politics that often focuses on big leaders and on the party structure itself. That's often done in a very insider sort of way and, disconnected from the rest of the country. And then there is a really large cohort of very well-meaning journalists who travel very far and wide at a time when it is very hot, and do make an attempt to reach inaccessible places and marginalized people. But they report in a way that is so disconnected from actual politics that it seems like reporting that could be done at any time of the year. So, the typical sort of script is to land up at a tiny place and, say how close it is to a big city, but still so cut off. These are its issues. Then they'll, interview a few people, usually men, who say, nobody ever comes here, nobody cares, we don't care which party we vote for, and sort of that's it. But that's just not how politics works in this country. There's such an intimate relationship between voters and political parties, so deeply ideological, that I wish these two strands of journalism could come together and produce meaningful political journalism and commentary.
But do you think that part of the problem then is that we perhaps don't adequately invest in good political reporting in between elections? Because what you're saying essentially is we need to understand better the connections that voters forge with local politicians, with parties, with party structures. And a lot of that is happening in between the 5 years of elections, right? In between 2014 and 2019. So would you identify that as potentially, one source of the issue?
Yes, that's definitely one source of the issue, to not see politics as a periodic thing that happens once in 5 years, to not see it as an event, but to see it as a continuous sort of relationship. But I think the other problem also is that a large part of journalists, especially these sort of well-meaning journalists I'm describing, see politics as something unholy. So if they're reporting on it in this sort of arm's length way, it's because they're sort of holding their noses when they talk about politics at all. That's not how voters feel about politics. They might complain about, politicians getting very rich and being very disconnected. They might complain about that. But they don't see politics as unholy and as something to be kept at a distance. That's something that doesn't intersect with their lives, that doesn't bring meaning to their lives, that doesn't, the history of social justice movements and social justice political parties in India. It was a combination of being, the point was that political parties realized the deepest rooted feeling among voters for dignity, for self-respect. That first, and then economic goods later. And, that's what they built on. That's what they championed. And I don't think journalists adequately understand that. It's entirely possible that a lot of it has to do with the vast majority of Indian journalists being upper caste Hindus, that this sort of dignity that politics can bring people's lives is not something they even imagine. And that translates into how they report. They're well-meaning, but it's just not political journalism to me.
So, one of the standard complaints about political reporting has been the lack of data and the paucity, let's say, of data journalism in India. Now, in recent months and years, we've seen an explosion in this kind of data journalism on this side of the Atlantic now. This is kind of the hottest game in town in Washington, D.C. Tell us about how data journalism has fared in India, and, how do you assess its impacts sort of on newsrooms more broadly?
Right. So I'd say it is the hottest thing in Indian journalism too as well right now. And it's been a big part of this election reporting. It's an improvement and a step up from 2014. That is a change. There's a lot of good, a lot for it to commend itself. So, for example, one of the, I think, important insights that's come both from sort of shoe leather reporting and from data crunching, and it's interesting when these two sometimes come out to the same conclusions, right? It says something. It has been, for example, looking at UP, where multiple sets of reporting seem to point out that at least among a subset of Congress candidates, there does seem to be some element of, not putting up candidates in strong candidates in seats where they could threaten the Mahagathbandhan, the SP-BSP alliance, a sort of friendly fight. This is something that came up both through data journalism by Samarth Bansal and others at India Today, and through some political reporting as well. So, this isn't a sort of established fact. It's something to look at, but this is a sort of interesting intersection of data journalism and regular reporting. And I think this is one of the areas that I've found data journalism useful, when it's tried to intersect with much more deeply political issues than a lot of the rest of what's happening. Otherwise, I'd say there's a fair amount of journalism coming out of the data crunching that good academics are doing, right? Like the Trivedi Center for Political Data, journalists using the data, coming up with useful stuff. I'd say Hindustan Times is doing a good job of trying to look at socioeconomic data and the way that could intersect with what's called identity politics. Those are interesting things that are happening. But again, I feel like maybe journalists are not able to step out enough to answer core questions and see how data can answer those questions. And, maybe I share some blame in this as well, because here we are halfway through the election season, and two of the questions that I would most like answered, I'm still in the process of answering them myself through data. One of which is, why do parties select the candidates they do? Right? This is something that data can go a long way towards answering, without resorting to sort of labels like, oh, they just picked the caste equation that works, or oh, they just picked the person with the most money, or the person with the most criminal cases. That's not true. That's not how it works. And the other issue being that, given that we now know that close to half of people probably make up their minds during campaign season, what is it, at what point of time, and through what sort of trigger or incentive or moment or speech are people making up their minds? We've not come any closer to answering that, either through shoe leather reporting or through data. And these are two among many questions that I feel we should have done by now. We should have got closer to answering them.
Let me ask you about another question that a lot of people are asking this time, which has to do with women voters. So your series for Scroll, How India Votes, for me anyway, has been one of the real highlights of the 2019 election campaign. In your series, you've covered everything from gender to caste to young voters in your regular dispatches for Scroll. On the issue of female voters, there's been a lot of talk in 2019 about, this is sort of the year of the women voter. Do you think that there's something actually distinctive about this election insofar as women are concerned?
I think it's really hard to say. And one of the reasons it's hard to say is because so few news reporters speak to women. I've seen a couple of stories and series that try to speak to women voters only. That's one way of going about it. But it's very hard to tell because the sort of boilerplate for how a constituency is reported on, you go there and speak to 4 or 5 what are supposed to be representative people who talk about the issues of the constituency and then talk to the candidates about it. Those sort of stories rarely quote women. And I understand many journalists say that it's extremely hard to draw out women. First of all, because women work really hard in this country. They're constantly doing something. They're not free to sit under the tree and talk to you about issues. They often, greater inhibitions, all of that. No doubt it's difficult, but I guess journalism is not supposed to be easy. So it's hard for me to say. I think one thing that's really been happening is that female representation on the electoral rolls has been improving thanks to the Election Commission, and female turnout has also been increasing significantly. So if there was a distinct way that women were voting, it could be having an impact on elections. Historically, there hasn't been. Women don't historically vote on a very different set of issues than men in an election. So it's hard to tell if that's happening. I think one thing that's happened is that parties are very conscious of the need to appeal to women. The BJP has clearly worked on this very hard because not all, but some pre-election polling seems to indicate that they've nearly closed the gender disadvantage that they have historically faced, while the Congress doesn't seem to have significantly improved upon it. There hasn't been an improvement in female representation in the candidate list at all. And I think there is evidence that women-led parties attract more women voters. There's evidence from Bengal and from Tamil Nadu on this. So that's not got better, except for, of course, the 2 standout examples being the BJD in Orissa that decided to reserve a third of tickets for women, and the Trinamool Congress, which didn't take a new decision. It's just always given a lot more seats to women. So I think parties are conscious of it. They've not significantly, worked upon it, but I don't know. I don't feel like I've seen good enough evidence to think that there's something monumentally different that women are doing this time around.
Let me just ask you quickly about another kind of enduring question, and we've heard a lot of talk about this as well, which has to do with the issue of caste. Now, of course, we all know, journalists, social scientists, researchers, analysts, that caste still matters when it comes to voting. But at the same time, there is a growing sense that caste is maybe no longer the sole or even the most important determinant of voter choices. And I'm wondering, this is something I really struggle with. How do you think about the role that caste is playing in Indian politics today? I've heard you say in other contexts that we're in a caste plus environment. So what does that mean? What does caste plus entail?
We are in a caste plus environment, but I don't think that we're in this caste plus environment for the first time. I don't think that the appeal to caste in politics, electoral politics, has ever worked in the sort of one-dimensional way that many people believe that it does. The call to caste solidarity or to caste groups is not just a word, right? It's all that it means with it. It's when it's talking about, when it's a call among marginalized or backward groups, it's about, as I said at the start of this, about identity, about self-respect, about much more than what comes later, much more than the economic growth, prosperity that you're talking about later. It starts from self-respect, from mutual respect. So I don't think that didn't exist in the past, and I don't think that that's reduced as well now. So that is, to me, that remains what the call to caste is about. And this is something that I know that you've talked about before, that people don't adequately acknowledge how deeply ideological Indian politics is. And to me, this intersects with caste, the deep ideological beliefs that people hold. They aren't sort of casteless, and not being casteless doesn't mean that they operate in some, utopian world. It just means that people's core beliefs also have a strong element of who it is that is giving them the respect that they have been denied for centuries. I think parties maybe talk differently about caste, and they Prime Minister Modi is a prime example of this. He talks in a way that when people say caste plus or casteless, that's what they usually mean, the way he talks about it. But Modi is not operating in a vacuum. There's all the other hardcore mobilization that's gone on that's allowing him to talk in this casteless way. If things were truly casteless right now, just look at the candidate lists and how clear it is, both to journalists analyzing it and obviously to the party officials who are creating those lists, how much clear planning around caste equations there is. Okay, the parties know better than anybody else what they're doing. They know perfectly well why they need to make these appeals. So that's one of the things that makes it very clear to me that both parties and voters still know what they're talking about. Maybe in the past, politicians felt that they could talk less about the other stuff, and I do think that there's a bit of fatigue around purely identity discourse. I don't think that's been happening for a while. I haven't seen that sort of discourse for a while at all. So yes, there is an appeal through caste, through the caste of the candidate, and then the promise of what will be delivered maybe across caste groups. But I'm very uncomfortable with this narrative that's developed around it, that it used to be a very caste-driven appeal, and that now it's casteless because that's what young people want. I just don't think that that's how politics works at all.
Let me end by asking you a question that relates to the BJP and its electoral math. We had a chance to work together, which was a lot of fun, on a Carnegie report that looked at the BJP's 5 years in power and the question of nationalism and its impacts. And your chapter specifically focused on the BJP's electoral math. And thinking about 2019, you identified sort of 3 challenges the BJP could face in terms of repeating its historic 2014 performance. And I'd love for you to just briefly tell our listeners a bit about each of these, and I just want to tick them off. The first is that, the coalition that the BJP constructed of upper castes and backward castes has shown some cracks or some divisions. That's number one. Number 2 and number 3 are somewhat related, which is, the BJP's anti-minority rhetoric in 2019 could put off voters who were attracted by his more hopeful economic messaging in 2014, which is linked to the third point, which is, a lot of economic conservatives are sort of disappointed with the Modi government's performance and feel that there's been less attention given to, say, markets, to reforms, and more attention that's been paid to kind of the social majoritarian agenda. Tell us a little bit about the challenges that the BJP faces as it's headed into this election in terms of replicating the performance that it put together in 2014.
Right. So, yes. So, I think the first one, the social coalitions one, deals with much larger swathes of people, and so is is much more sort of relevant or is much more important to this. I think one area that all opinion polling has shown is clearly a problem for the BJP has been with the scheduled caste vote. It's widely believed that that the BJP won significant sections of the SC vote, partly by appealing to groups within SCs who felt that that they had not been adequately represented, and that other SC groups had been able to derive much more benefit out of political representation. This in a way is linked to the anti-minority rhetoric, because it wasn't just rhetoric. There's been countless examples of violence, right down to murder, of both Muslim and SC cattle traders and people involved with skinning or disposing of animals because of the whole rhetoric around beef and about cows being holy and about cows being holy to Hinduism, and this entirely new profession of cow vigilantes that has developed around them. So there's opinion polling to show that this sort of violence significantly affected the SC vote. In particular states, it's going to be interesting to see whether Dalits believe that there is a strong alternative. It's going to be interesting to see in UP, for example, in Uttar Pradesh, whether the alliance of the backwards, the SP-BSP alliance, is going to be able to successfully draw the SC vote back towards them. So yes, this social coalition that was built perhaps partly around anti-minority rhetoric in 2014, there are cracks appearing in it. As for the other 2 points, which yes are linked, I believe that the constituency of people who are put off by anti-minority rhetoric because they believe, because they voted for Modi on economic grounds is probably quite slim. It's probably quite vocal, but I think in terms of numbers, it's small. And yes, I think there is definite frustration with the economy, not in terms of markets or reform of that sort of stuff, because again, I think that's a very small constituency. More in terms of just not having delivered on income growth. This widely believed to be felt across rural India and across farm families, and these are sort of very tangible things. But here we come to the issue of again the very nature of electoral politics. There's a big leap to be made between being unhappy with your current economic situation, even if it's as literal as the food on your plate, and being angry with the government that you felt should have delivered it, because politics doesn't necessarily work in such transactional ways. So again, what's going to be important is to see whether the strong personal connect that Modi was able to build with voters in 2014 has endured to the point that despite these frustrations on economic issues, which are definitely there, I don't think a vote in favor of the BJP means that these economic issues are not there. That they're just clearly numerically there. But it's going to the key is to see whether his personal appeal, and I don't just mean in terms of his personality, all of the appeals and the connect that he's been able to build with voters, whether that is able to endure these economic frustrations.
Rukmini, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show. It's been so fun to read your work, and we're just days away now from May 23rd and the outcome, and we look forward to your post-election analysis so you can help explain for the world really what took place in these elections and how voting dynamics change, if they change at all. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jamie Hinson and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin's our audio engineer, and Lauren Duax our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.